I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Tonight we're very pleased to have Joshua Sperling here with us to talk about his new book from Verso called A Writer of Our Time, The Life and Work of John Berger. The book is hot off the press, so I have an advantage over most of you in that I've read the book in an advance copy, and I have about 100 pages of notes and about 100 questions. So I'll try to pick a few of the more relevant ones. And then we'll open up to questions from you all. Actually, if you have a question or something to say at any time, just let us know. I want to make a disclosure or a disclaimer at the beginning so there's no confusion later. John Berger's writing changed my life and made possible everything that I've done as a writer over the past 40 years or so. And the person, John Berger, also changed my life, and I loved him. So anything I say about him in this book should probably be judged with this in mind. Now that I've completely destroyed my credibility in the eyes of some people, let's start. Josh contacted me 5 years ago when you were working on your dissertation on John Berger at Yale. And at that point, you'd met John and talked with a number of his collaborators and wanted to talk with me about him and my relation to him. And we met and talked a few times as the book was being written, but it was early stages before it became the book, I think.
And that was when he was still alive.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Yeah.
A few years before.
Mm-hmm.
I know that after you graduated from Berkeley, you spent a few years traveling and teaching in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and that you first encountered Berger's writing when you were 22.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that, or actually, tell us about that.
Yeah, I too think I would not be where I am. I wouldn't be a writer without John Berger. And I mentioned this last night. I had a reading last night, so I might be repeating myself. But I was asked by Verso to give a list of books that were my favorite books this year. And I was thinking that the way that I read books now is so different than when I was in my early 20s. I have friends who are writing books. I look forward to it. I'm reading it. I'm evaluating it as a critic. But when you're a young person trying to figure out what to do with your life, a writer can really have a tremendous impact on you. And that was certainly the case for me when I was 22. And to give some sort of background to that, I grew up in Southern California in a kind of planned community. My parents were professors. They were scientists. And it sounds strange. I use this joke. I say, like, I wasn't raised by wolves, but I was raised by scientists, which is sort of, I think, this specific kind of American breed of intellectual coming out of the Cold War, but without any sense of history, I think. And when I got to Berkeley when I was 17, I think by that point, the only adults I'd really ever talked to were scientists. And they all just assumed that you go to college, you study math or physics, and then you trickle down the hill to some other discipline in the sciences. So I went to Berkeley and I studied physics. But when I was there, I met all sorts of other people who were interested in the arts, interested in politics. And an event that was very formative for me, and we can maybe loop back to that later, was the attacks of September 11th, which happened when I was in my second year. And I remember waking up that morning and seeing the news and going to my thermodynamics class. And the professor just sort of said, I'm sorry, we'll just carry on, and here's the equation for entropy and so forth. And it felt really kind of distant, actually. And that, I think, was a moment that I started to, I know 9/11 for a lot of people is this sort of resurgent patriotism and so forth. For me, it wasn't that. It was more that I became interested in what was out there, what was beyond California, beyond the little sort of curated bubble that I had the privilege to grow up in. And I also started moving away from science around that time, and I started taking a lot of classes in media and political theory and art history. And I started traveling a lot. And my girlfriend in college was from India. She's from Gujarat, and we spent about 6 months afterwards in India. And I think that year after you, if you go to college, if you have the privilege to go to college, I think that the transition from high school to college is so intense, and you're sort of reading theory for the first time, and you're encountering, radical ideas and so forth. But that year after is a really interesting year, I think, in people's development, because up until that point, you've sort of been just reading syllabi and in the libraries and in classrooms and in seminars. And then I went out and I was sort of traveling and backpacking and working odd jobs and meeting a whole swath of people, many of whom never went to college, many of whom worked with their hands to make a living, many of whom worked the land in India and Nepal. And when I read Berger's writing, I found this mix that I'd never found before between a writer who has such an analytic intelligence and is very well versed in the history of 20th century politics and the entire sort of European tradition of painting. And yet his writing never smelled like a seminar or a symposium. It never smelled like just the library. In fact, it smelled like the outdoors. It smelled like the sun, in a sense. And that was such a rare thing for me to encounter. And I say, there's a line in the book where I say, of all the critical theorists to have emerged from the New Left, Berger was perhaps its only plein air practitioner. So I think that almost the way that like French painters in the 19th century took the tradition of the oil painting outside and outdoors and put it in contact with the sun and so forth, I think Berger was doing something similar with political modernism, with European modernism, philosophical modernism. And I got the sense that he never thought that knowledge only came from books, which is rare among a lot of academics and intellectuals. So he was sort of straddling this mixture of kind of thought and experience, which I found just so like amazing, actually. And I devoured his work, and I carried the book of selected essays that was edited by Jeff Dyer, I think in the early 2000s, the paperback, around with me when I went to Europe and lived and worked and taught English and sort of educated myself about all that I'd missed because I didn't have a kind of great books curriculum. So I went to museums and public libraries and met all sorts of people and learned languages. And Berger really was, I think, for me, he was a kind of interface with everything, with the world. I mean, he's the kind of writer where you don't read him and sort of stay in sort of this lane. There's something in which he is almost a kind of membrane that opens up and that is a lens that lets you see things around you, lets you encounter others. And in that sense, he's a remarkably generous writer. So long before I ever thought that I would write a book about him, he was my kind of informal teacher. And long before I met him, too, he was an informal kind of guide. And then when I found out that his papers were being donated to the British Archive, truth be told, I went to graduate school at Yale, and about a couple years in, I was like, I don't know, precisely because a lot of what I was learning was so kind of stuffy. And I was thinking, maybe I'll take some time off, et cetera. But around the time that I had to think of a dissertation topic, I learned that his papers, he had just donated his papers, and all these folks from the British Library came. He was giving away for free. A lot of other writers, like, Salman Rushdie, it's like an undisclosed amount, how much Emory paid for his papers. A lot of writers kind of have a bidding war. And Berger actually gave them away for free under the condition that the British Library had to come and actually kind of harvest his papers from his sort of hayloft in France. But this sort of event was happening right when I was at a juncture in my life again. And I said, hey, I want to like learn more about this person. And so I floated it, and luckily I had, if you're ever go to grad school, it's important to have just one person who's going to sign off on what you do. And I luckily had that, and that was Dudley Andrew, who himself wrote a dissertation on Andre Bazin, who's a film critic, was not an academic, also very much kind of broke the mold of the kind of visual theorist, but out in the world. And he very much was supportive of my project. And then I met him, I met Berger, spent some time talking to him and his collaborators, and it was, again, this whole other way of rediscovering the 20th century through this man's work. So very much for me, it was learning about Berger in this project, but also learning from him and learning through him. I didn't want it to be the kind of biography that's like an 800-page tome that goes summer by summer, vacation by vacation, doctor visit by doctor visit, affair by affair through the life. I've never actually enjoyed those biographies. In fact, I've never finished one, frankly. I know that they need to be written, but I wanted to write something that got at the kind of core of the life and the core decisions and the core conflicts.
So your book is really an intellectual biography or a literary biography, not a personal biography, although you do set the stage for different periods by what was going on in his life, but it really is more about the work, and that personal biography is going to be left to Berger's official biographer, Tom Overton.
Who's a good friend of mine, actually, yeah.
And he became a friend as you were working on the...
Yeah, we were roommates together in Stoke Newington for a little while, and we'd get lunch every day at the British Library, and Tom's an extraordinary friend, an extraordinary writer. Yeah.
And when will that biography come out?
A few years. I think it depends. I mean, it's one of these things, like I actually, thankfully, before I learned, Tom and I met because we sort of gravitated towards each other. He's kind of the British... We were like, weird, it's like encountering your doppelganger or something. And we love electronic music, we like soccer, so but I think when before I knew that he was gonna sort of be adopted in as the official biographer, it's like this red pill, blue pill moment, where I was like, I could take the red pill and spend 10 years learning, kind of stalking this man, you know, and almost like spending more time reading about his life than he spent living it, and kind of just obsessing over it. And there's a strong draw to that when you have your hero, when you have a hero of some kind in your life, there's a strong draw to know everything about them and know their faults. And I learned, you know, oh, he had an affair with this person, or oh, there was a kind of liaison, and there's a lot of skeletons in the closet and so forth. But I started to think, like, Berger would never write that about anybody else. He never would. In his book about other artists, It's always about the work, and it's about the relationship of the work to history. So I myself am I think it's a service to have a biography written that goes through the life. And I think I'm very curious to read Tom's work, and we're good friends, but I think before I even knew that there was a sort of tacit division of labor there, I decided I wanted to live my own life. And there's actually a line that sort of became a guiding kind of mantra for me, which was Berger reviewing the autobiographical novels of Peter Weiss, who's, like him, was a kind of communist and an exile and trained as a painter and then turned to writing later in his life. And he says that in Weiss's novels, that about himself, it's not the kind of Nausgardian thing, right? It's not about the secret difference between the writer's private life and public life, but it's obsessed with the relationship between the intimate self of the writer and the unprecedented events of his period. So I wanted to get away from this kind of secret difference between the public Berger and the private Berger. And I would even encounter plenty of letters where I'm like, this isn't so relevant, you know, like he's complaining about his eczema or something, you know. And
do you know why? I mean, I never talked to him about it, but I heard that he was really against a full-scale biography. Yeah.
Everybody would ask him to write an autobiography, and he would say, he always came up with, you know, reasons why. He'd say, what happened to me in my boarding school time is not of world historical importance, so I'm not going to write about that. I'm going to write about matters of world. I think the truth is that his memory was selective, like all of our memories are. There is, I think, a front side and a back side to all of us, like a radio, you know, and I think any kind of, having not really read too many of these 800-page biographies, I do think that there's a kind of fork in the road. You either go the hagiographic route, where you print the legend, or you go the route where you kind of psychoanalyze all of the kind of personality flaws and almost like diagnose the character as almost like you're their psychiatrist or something. And you know, I thought the way Berger thinks about other artists, the way he writes about Rothko recently, he goes through the life and he dramatizes the character of the artist. So he's very interested in the character of the artist, but he's not interested in all the kind of salacious detail. And he even, when he talks about Rothko being an immigrant and belonging to this generation of Jewish immigrants who's extremely important for Berger, he talks about the essential truth of Rothko's life. So I don't think I was really drawn to write something that felt human and felt personal, and felt kind of, I wanted to read like a story. And Berger, I think, really kind of collapsed this distinction between a critical argument and a story. And a lot of his essays are actually kind of propelled by some kind of narrative thrust. And I'm just trying to get at the core of the character of Berger, but the character of Berger that comes through the work, the Berger that we all know. And when I met him, I think he'd sort of become this figure. And I was interested in the history that led up to that, but less sort of about, I do speculate about his relationship with his parents and his relationship in boarding school, because I think that's important. But I'm much more interested in the kind of historical times that he's reacting to almost on a year-to-year basis, because his thinking is so interbraided with history in the way that maybe intellectuals today with the Trump election and so forth. Yes, we care about what's going on in, you know, the bedroom, but we also, I think it's more interesting to think about how people intellectuals and writers are reacting to the world as it's changing around them.
So just to set he was born in 1926 to middle-class London parents. His father was an accountant.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that his parents, Stanley and Miriam, by the time he was born, they were very middle class, very kind of classically British upper middle class. In their youth, they were idealists. And Stanley actually his father had wanted to be an Anglican priest. And I think there's a religious strain that runs throughout Berger and an emphasis on faith and belief. And it's interesting that so much of the European painting tradition that he was formed by grew out of Christianity, really. And so I think that's unconscious in his thinking. But Stanley also enlisted to fight in the Great War and saw a great deal of destruction and violence, and even stayed on afterwards to help bury the dead in France. But when he came back, I think, according to Berger, he sort of perfected this upright English gentleman, sort of stiff upper lip. And I think that was really hard for Berger, because there's this trauma in his father's life that he was aware of, but he couldn't access, or the father didn't open up about. And I think that led to a lot of kind of what I think of as a kind of mixed, this is my psychological sort of reading of it that I do indulge in, is I think that there's a mixture of sort of affection and pity and sympathy for the father figure, but also tremendous resentment at the kind of stiff upper lip and the repression of pain, as if pain itself is undignified somehow. And that becomes sort of mapped on to his relationship to England as such, and sort of with the key intermediate term of the boarding schools. His mother, I should say, was also a suffragette in her youth, and was a housewife by the time that he was a young boy. And he was shipped off to boarding schools at age 6. And it's very difficult to learn about these boarding schools, but he always compared them to like a fascist boot camp. And he was miserable. And it was in that environment that he first started reading. He's very sensitive, reading a lot of poetry, and was very precocious, but miserable. And I think the kind of verbal one-upsmanship and power struggles, homosocial power struggles that take place among English gentlemen, was this world that he hated. And if in the book, I try to zero in on a few key decisions in his life, sort of existential decisions that we all make, a few of them over the course of a life that we can't explain, but are also weirdly overdetermined. And I think the main decision he made was when he was in his mid-30s to leave England behind and to say goodbye to England. And I think the seeds for that were maybe planted in the boarding school experience, where he decided, I don't want anything to do with this. And for somebody of his background, going to a school like this, it's very sort of, the expected trajectory would be to go to Oxford or Cambridge and then to become a kind of respectable civil servant, or like his father, a kind of businessman. And when he was 16, he was so miserable, he left. And in his kind of mythopoetic rendering of his life, he ran away from school, almost like an orphan running away in some Dickensian kind of manner. I know from a number of interviews with him that his father was absolutely against this. So whether it was him sort of packing his bags, leaving, or whatever, the decision was brokered, but the father was very, very against this.
This is at 16, he got a scholarship to the Central School of Art in London.
Yeah.
Fell in love for the first time.
Yeah.
And at age 18, he joined the army. He was spared from Normandy, and he stayed on in Northern Ireland and made this contact with working class men.
Right.
Which was something very unusual for somebody of his class background.
Right.
And that changed him.
Yeah, I think the 2 years spent in London, it's very important to know he came of age during the war. So World War II is absolutely formative for him. And I mentioned in the book that I think that this experience of, I'm curious because some of you are probably art students as well, and I think there's a kind of romantic idea of the art school and of sort of a place where art is really center stage. And for Berger, he was a draftsman and a good drawer. And this time in 1942 to 1944, and it's interesting that he later co-translated a book by Nella Bielski called The Years 42. I think this is a key year for him. There's sort of, as I see it, there's three kind of formative theaters, is how I describe it in the book for him, is the art school, which is a tremendous place of freedom coming from the boarding school. And then this kind of very impoverished, rented bedroom that he's sharing with another student who's a little older than him, and it's the first woman he ever loves. And he's sort of creatively and artistically discovering himself, erotically discovering himself, and at the same time the city has just been bombed. And this is a city at war. And so there's tremendous urgency and a tremendous national sentiment that sort of very much puts into sharp relief the small dramas that you're living. And I think that's one of the reasons we love war movies, right? And romantic war movies, that the personal and the kind of international are kind of in such sharp relief. Those 2 years, I think, are kind of the crucible of this. And then he does join the army, age 18. He could have had an officer's commission. I think I'm curious to learn exactly whether in his rendering, he turned it down as in protest. I think I've heard some other accounts too that it was more complex. But he ended up not seeing combat and working as a training officer with these working class cadets in Northern Ireland. And this was the first time in his life that he spent a lot of time around the working class, because England's a very class segregated society. And he says, and I think it's important as part of his self-conception, that he would write letters for them home to their girlfriends and their mothers. And I think I think he started to find this role for him, this archetypal role for himself of giving voice.
Soldier and scribe.
Yeah, soldier and a scribe, as somebody who everything is at stake. And there's a tremendous sense when you read Berger that everything is at stake, in a way that when you read a lot of academic critics, you kind of get the sense that maybe their tenure case is at stake, but that's like, there's not like that much so I think he has this sense that everything is at stake, and that he's sort of speaking on behalf of those without a voice. And I think he went on to later famously do this for the disappearing peasant community in the Alpine part of the Alps in Europe. But I think he also sort of had both the gall, but also the circumspection, the empathy, but also the tact to kind of do it in the right way, I think, with migrant workers, and also with a forested community in the north of England that is kind of like the equivalent of like the rural Pennsylvania or something, like a very kind of left behind region in England, and sort of speak on behalf of their kind of the plight of being a very impoverished backwater with not a lot of prospects. So I think that was very important for him to sort of potentially romanticized, but a sort of idea that he's here to sort of struggle and to give voice to those that are not allowed access to kind of national culture in particular.
In writing these letters, he had to be very direct. Soon after that, he started writing for radio and then TV, and writing for as wide an audience as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, that was there from the very beginning. So jumping ahead a little bit, I mean, if it wasn't for Ways of Seeing, Berger would be little known, probably, although there were other big moments where he broke out into a truly public role. But Ways of Seeing was, I wanted to say before that the book does have a narrative to it, and when you're going through all of these early formative experiences, and you sometimes are pretty hard on him. The book kind of is probably your trajectory with him, where it becomes more and more, you're more and more invested in it and him as a figure, as a person. And by the end, it's fully, I mean, that's sort of, and the other thing I wanted to ask about, I mean, the other thing that arcs over the whole book is what he meant to the New Left. Both the background of that and later what he meant, but putting that in context of the historical period. He became the only Marxist critic working in England for a big publication, The New Statesman, and he became the Marxist art critic.
Yeah.
And then I'm probably not getting the timing exactly right, but so Permanent Red was a collection of those pieces, and there were fights along the way. The other thing about the book, it's amazing how he was continually putting himself in the position, or finding himself in the position of being a lightning rod for controversy, for culture wars, basically. Over and over again it happened.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I'm curious to think about where I'm hard on him. But we can get to that, but I will say that the last thing I wanted to do was to do a kind of photoshopped, when you get married, you get these like photoshopped portraits, and they like have a little like ding, and like, and they get rid of the stuff under your eyes, and I hate, it's like, if you want to have brilliance, you need to have shade, in my opinion. And so I wanted to do a portrait that is human, that he's, and I think I wanted to put him back into history, because I think one of the things that happens when in his later life, he did have a lot of followers, and a lot of people who really, like me, were in love. I mean, in fact, like in a kind of platonic, love of this person, and I think that can lead to, like, it's as if he just sort of existed off on in the mountain and wasn't actually swimming through history. And so when I started to do research and read his early articles and his correspondences, I realized he was so many historical currents are running through this guy that have been sort of just dropped. And as he's been sort of turned into this kind of happy grandfather figure near the end of his life. And so I didn't want to be afraid of being hard on him, but I wanted the book to be imbued with tremendous sympathy, because I mean, I think I respect him all the more by being hard on him, because it was hard. It was very hard, and he made some wrong decisions sometimes. And I think there's a quote that I mentioned that was written in the introduction to Simone Weil's book. Simone Weil's very interesting French, Jewish, Christian... Big figure for Berger, and effectively kind of died during the war out of sort of self-imposed malnutrition, and was a kind of mystical philosopher, very interesting figure. And she wrote a book called The Need for Roots, or L'Enracinement in French. And when it was published in English, T.S. Eliot, who also knew Berger, small world.
What was T.S. Eliot, an early acquaintance of Berger? What was that?
I mean, everybody knew everybody back then. He'd go to dinner parties at T.S. Eliot, and I don't think they were friends, but I think they sort of knew each other. But Eliot wrote in the introduction to Simone Weil's book that what's more important than agreement or dissent, because not everybody can, he said it's impossible to imagine somebody agreeing with all of her views. So more important than agreement and dissent is to make contact with a great soul. And I think for me, I never in doubt was Berger sort of a great soul for me, and just a kind of a miracle that he existed. But I did want to sort of understand and register the pressures that he was under at certain times. And I think by appreciating sort of the hard aspects of his life, we can appreciate the sort of resilience that he embodied all the more. But I would say that in terms of he's very much not conflict averse. He's the opposite of conflict averse at certain times. And
who was it that you quote somebody saying at some point, you get attacked so much, it's like you like being attacked.
Oh yeah, that's what I think Zola said that to Manet. Yeah. It's like, for somebody who fights back as well as you do, you must love being attacked. Yeah. And I think, but it's important for Berger, for Ways of Seeing. That's Ways of Seeing, which was this television show on the BBC. I'm sure most sort of students have probably been shown it in a class, and was also turned into a kind of mass market paperback by Penguin, best-selling. I was just on Amazon, and they have these stupid metrics where they tell you what your list, like, this is like number whatever in media studies. Ways of Seeing was on there. It's like number 1 in media studies. Still. So this was his kind of key, what do you call it, like crossover moment. Like, this was his single that kind of went global and went viral. And that happened in 1972. But it's important to know that before there was the Berger of Ways of Seeing, or the Berger who donated half of the Booker Prize money to the Black Panthers that same year in 1972, there was the Berger who was like a staunch defender of realism in the British arts. And so he actually, within England, not America, but within England, he was a celebrity in his late 20s, actually. Yeah. He trained as a painter after the war, but didn't get a lot of traction with painting. But once he started writing and lecturing, within 1 year, and I kind of go into this a little bit in the book, in 1952, which is this very year where politics is shifting, because the post-war socialist moment where, I mentioned this in the book, it's important to remember that Churchill lost the general election in 1945. After the war, there's tremendous socialist kind of camaraderie in England. That kind of ebullient, we made it through, we'd survived, and now we have the National Health Service, we have the welfare state. That was shifting sort of imperceptibly into a kind of new Cold War order. And Berger comes of age right as these two kind of tides are battling. And in 1952, he's 26. He starts that year unknown. By the end of that year, on the basis of his reviews, and because he actually was given this amazing he just was in the right place at the right time, where he curated his own show at the Whitechapel Gallery, which is a very big gallery in London. So he's just given a carte blanche to basically do his show. And he becomes the kind of like the young star of the art writing world. And at first people are kind of, a lot of the establishment is exciting. They're excited by Berger because he's connecting art to the everyman, because he's against the kind of snobbish, experimentally complex forms of modernism, and he wants art to be about everyday life and in the post-war spirit of the street and public spaces, very much like 19th century realism, actually. And a lot of his elders are sort of in favor of this because, and he's actually at a moment where the radio wants to like educate everyday British people about art, and he's riding this wave. But when the Cold War starts to come in, a lot of the same people who were sort of excited about his rise start to see him as a menace and as a kind of shadow Stalinist. And I mentioned in the book, I think it's interesting to just point this out, especially in this context with SVA, because I'm sure that as a school, you've been rocked by the kind of controversies in the art world of the last few years, I would imagine. And when I started writing this book, it was very difficult for me to understand what it's like to be a kind of critic or a writer and to feel the pressure that the position you take vis-a-vis something can feel like a matter of life or death. And if you break ranks with sort of the accepted opinion about this or that scandal, it can be like, the world's sky's caving in. And I think for Berger, there was a scandal that was very kind of the lightning rod of this Cold War moment, which is the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London, which is kind of bastion of the post-war avant-garde, held a competition for a sculpture that was a monument that was supposed to be built in West Berlin as a tribute to the unknown political prisoner. Later, it was found out that the two Americans with connections to the CIA had actually funded the prize money for this, which is a very big amount. It was like 10,000 pounds. And the sculptor that was chosen was Reg Butler, who's a British avant-garde, sort of in the vein of Giacometti slightly, sculptor. And when his model was exhibited at the Tate, which is the National Gallery in England, a Hungarian refugee went into the museum, picked up the sculpture, and threw it to the ground and twisted it and committed this act of art vandalism and handed a pre-written statement to the guard, which basically said that to reduce the victims of totalitarianism to this kind of aesthetic nonsense is like a double indignity, and to turn our suffering into a kind of high culture fair is bullshit. And Berger actually wrote an article that became a touchstone in this controversy afterwards, where he said, the ICA has failed, and we now reveal the bankruptcy of so-called modern art in our time. And he even pointed out that the kind of collection of scraps that had taken the place on the plinth and the Tate Modern, or the Tate, not the Tate Modern, a lot of the visitors thought that might have been the actual winning sculptor. And he's like, this is ridiculous. This is, and that this kind of, he was sort of registering this movement of the museum space away from the experience of violence and of everyday people. And I think, and he just got the wrath from the gods for the article that he wrote for that. And he had and there's a back and forth with all sorts of people like Sir Herbert Reed. Pretty much all of the British establishment just ganged up on him at that point and said, you're basically, and they invoked Orwell. They're like, this is the beginning of Newspeak. You're a Stalinist. If we, permit this, pretty soon we're going to be living in a kind of 1984. But he had a very famous statement, which was sort of his statement of declaration, where he said, far from dragging politics into art, art has dragged me into politics. And then he wrote that when he was 26, 27.
This was also part of, it came up when talking about his father, and he had a father figure thing, an edible thing with a number of figures, and one of them was Herbert Reed, who he wrote to when he was 14 and had this admiring relationship, and then Herbert Reed attacked him.
Would constantly attack him. Oh yeah, no, that wasn't the only one. A couple of years later, Herbert Reed called Berger. I think he said, are we going to let the entire cultural scene of this country be hijacked by some frothy-mouthed Goebbels? Is what he said about Berger. So
not the last time, but he got compared to Goebbels.
Steven Spender compared him to Goebbels. Yeah. So this is, this is before Ways of Seeing. This is a buried history that nobody talks about, nobody knows about, because by the time Permanent Red comes out in 1960. So much has changed on a global political level. 1956, which is a watershed year for Europe, for Western communism, Western Marxism, for a number of reasons. Khrushchev's secret speech, the invasion of Hungary, put tremendous pressure on Western Marxists. And most communist parties in the West lost over half their members in that year. and many of them had nervous breakdowns. In fact, in some of the discussions I've had, Doris Lessing is an interesting figure. For those of you who've read Golden Notebook, is about essentially a veiled sort of autobiography of her personal breakdown at that time. And she and Berger were kind of dating briefly. And Berger comes out of this, his own...
They were meeting in Bergers.
Yeah,
Berger
Berger
had a club. And
yeah, there's 1950s England is actually this kind of, I think because Paris is like all the cafes of existentialism gets all the attention, 1950s England was an amazing time for intellectuals and critics and writers and to gather. And Berger, in fact, with some other folks, even started a kind of salon-style club in Oxford Circus called the Geneva Club, which had all sorts of painters and writers. And
what was it called, the Geneva?
I think it was after the Geneva Conventions, which is sort of interesting because he then later moves to Geneva.
Yeah.
But that's what he told me anyway. And Doris Lessing was there, all sorts of other, and this is also the time that, you know, Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon are wandering around and going to their own club, their own gentleman's club, and it's a very sort of wild time. But I think it's important to know that this history has been sort of buried, and I kind of equate it to the kind of buried root structure of the tree of Berger's whole career once he leaves England, are this nest of contradictions from the 50s. Because by 1956, so much has changed, and I think 1956 is very much like maybe 2016 in the contemporary moment, where you've been thinking that you've been living in a kind of, like history's moving in this one direction, and then all of a sudden something happens and you wake up from your collective hallucination and you're like, oh wow, okay. And and a lot of people have kind of quasi-traumatic reactions to it. So for a number of Western Marxists, what happened with the Soviet Union sort of revealing itself to be so brutal was devastating for their ideals. And many of them had breakdowns, and I think Berger probably had some, I don't know if it's, you know, diagnosable as a breakdown, but he certainly, he took a year off from writing his reviews, and his writing totally changed at that point, and he stopped being an activist in the usual sense and started being more of a historian and a creative writer. And that's something I also talk about in the book that I think is interesting, is that political disappointment was this kind of moment of genesis for him, actually, because the certainties of the kind of activism and the op-eds that he was writing no longer fit, and he had to kind of deal with the complexities and the contradictions of experience. So certain things that couldn't like add up theoretically, he was able to think through in the form of a novel. But by the time Permanent Red comes out, which is after all of this has happened, he basically redacts his own work and presents a kind of much more, a different picture than what was actually taking place in the 50s, one that very much belongs to a new political moment and that suppresses a lot of his more controversial stances.
And so A Painter of Our Time came out in 1958.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, so his first novel, well, there might have been something before that, but.
There was a book about an Italian painter called Renato Gattuso that appeared in East Germany. But you can buy it on Abe Books. It's like, not, you know, there's some copies floating around, but A Painter of Our Time was his first book. And it is interesting that for a critic, his first book was a novel. And I recommend reading it. It really is an amazing document. It's written by somebody who's about 30 years old, early 30s, but it's in the voice of an aging Hungarian painter who is based on a man named Peter Perry, who Berger knew, who had exhibited with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and a number of other very well-known sort of Hungarian modernists who fled the revolutions in Hungary and settled in Berlin at a time when all of the kind of avant-garde was in Berlin, but came to England and was effectively unknown and lived in poverty and obscurity. And so there's this amazing triangulation that's taking place in this novel where there's Berger writing in the voice of an older European, remembering the beginnings of modernism and the revolutions, and it's sort of, and he's kind of triangulating and seeing into his own future, in a sense, how he wants to grow old. And this figure of a kind of defiant, obstinate old man who's very virile and very sort of conspiratorial with the young is there in a painter of our time, and it runs through the work. And really, Berger became something like that. I mean, he's not obscure, but he became, I think, so it's a kind of, it's a remarkable document.
I find that novel holds up incredibly well today. I mean, there are all these people in it, real people that are barely concealed. So there's a caricature of Kenneth Clark, and there's a David Sylvester is in it, and all of these people, but
it's a roman à clef of 1950s London and the 1950s art scene, but it's also about what's so amazing about it is that it's a kind of a lot of his diary entries. It's in the form of a fictional diary, almost like Sartre's Nausea, which I think was a definite influence. And but a lot of these diaries veer into theory. But it's this amazing thing. It's almost like if you take a ready-made and you put it in a museum, it changes the way you look at it. I think it's like if you take theory and you put it in a diary form, it changes the way you look at it. Because he admits to so much more inner tension and confusion than he ever admitted in public polemics. And I think that's something that we realize, is that the struggles of the 1950s were not necessarily external struggles as much as they were internal struggles. And that's something I think that we might think about today, when I think there's a line in my book where I say a lot, to struggle is not only to struggle against your oppressors or your enemies, it's also to struggle to keep the multiple layers of your loyalties intact during periods of intense pressure where you're sort of asked politically to kind of become a kind of one-dimensional kind of, cadet almost on the front lines. So I think that book was a confessional, and it's an amazing work.
Just the passage about the private collection of Sir Gerald Banks, which is this caricature of Kenneth Clark, and going to his house and going to the collection is amazing. It could have been written yesterday.
Sir Kenneth Clark was one of the father figures that Berger felt a need to kind of slay, and Ways of Seeing was famously a kind of interpreted as a riposte to Kenneth Clark's show Civilization, which was this sort of TV event that would go to talk about European civilization from kind of Greek, Greco-Roman, through the Renaissance, and it's him going on location to all these places. But they knew each other back then, and there is a set piece where this painter goes to visit Sir Gerald Banks, is his name, and he says that this is like taxidermized artifacts. This art was alive once, and now here it's dead, and it's really chilling.
Yeah. About the book, you said, never before had a novel captured so forthrightly the phenomenology of sustained creative labor. So seen in hindsight, that the seeds of 1968 really, you say, took root in those months and years immediately following 1952. So out of the old left, the new left.
Out of 1956, yes. That was when the left could break free from Stalinism, and you can have an independent left that was, because before that, if you were to break ranks, you had to go to the God that failed camp, which is sort of this camp of professional anti-communism. It's a little, I equate this slightly to contemporary debates about Israel and Palestine. Like if Israel were to invade or take a military action that's so reprehensible, it puts tremendous pressure on kind of liberal Zionists in the West to condemn that action, but they're very sensitive about not just sort of be flipping and becoming some kind of part of the anti-Israeli kind of force. And so ideology aside, this dynamic was at play, and with the new left, you have the birth of, in 1956, University and Left's Review is founded, which then later becomes the New Left Review, which later becomes Verso, which is one of the reasons I wanted to publish with them, because they have such history in this. But you have a left that's younger and that is more creative. It's sort of open to more kind of contradictions. It's less cardboardy in its critiques. And that really sows the seeds for the birth of 68 throughout Europe, of a kind of left that absolutely rejects Stalinism, but also rejects kind of capitalist social democracy on the other hand.
Right. I want to hear a little bit more about, so there were these, Anya Bostock, who died
very
recently,
Yeah.
was an amazing figure. Talk a little bit about her influence on, well, she was translating Wilhelm Reich while he was writing G.
Yeah.
And she also was a big part of Ways of Seeing. She was in Ways of Seeing, right? She had a lot to do with what was going on.
Yeah, I think it's not so much an argument I make in the book, but it's in the book, and the way I structure it is I periodize, is the sort of jargony term, Berger's life. And I think there's basically 3 phases of his working life. There's the early phase of 1952 to 56 or 58, which takes place in a climate of the cultural Cold War. Then there's the period from the late 50s through the mid 70s, when what we called the 60s, what today we know as the 60s, which is sort of this explosion of revolutionary energy where there's immense questioning taking place in all sorts of fields. That is the new left period, and he was with Anya Bostock in that period. And then then the last period is really from the mid-70s to the present, and politically that's the sort of age of dominance of global finance capital and what we would call sort of neoliberal globalization. We can get to that later, but I think one of the amazing things with Berger is that his personal life was split quite evenly on these historical fault lines, as if he couldn't go on with his personal structures past once history had sort of rearranged itself. And so by 1956-58, he's actually been married and divorced twice. And that's interesting. And his second wife is a much older aristocrat. And I don't dwell on this, but I do kind of point out that this must have been
15 years older or 10
20, I think close to 20.
Yeah.
So there are contradictions here. But when he meets Anya Bostock, that women play an important part in this history. And I sort of mentioned that there's an unfortunate tradition of very smart women sort of subordinating their careers to their male partners. It still happens. And Anya Bostock was a brilliant woman who's sort of hasn't gotten her due. She was born in Russia to a kind of fairly aristocratic family, fled during the Russian Revolution to Vienna, where she lived next door to Sigmund Freud, actually. And according to family lore, had her girlhood stutter sort of treated by Freud. And then fled again Austria when Hitler annexed Austria to England. And had been married, and she was actually dating for a long time this best friend of Berger's named Peter de Francia, who is a social realist painter, and they were together for like 10 years, Anya Bostock and Peter de Francia. And it's actually through de Francia that Berger got a lot of his ideas about realism and Gramsci and neorealism from Italy, because this guy de Francia had spent a lot of time in Italy and knew all of the people in the kind of that world. But Anya Bostock and Berger got together in the late 50s, and they eventually moved to Europe together. And she was an amazing translator because she spoke all these languages, and she translated Brecht, Walter Benjamin, George Lukács, Wilhelm Reich, all of the sort of Leroy-Gourand later, yeah, the anthropologist. So part of the New Left, in that it was shedding its Stalinist kind of, baggage, was that they were rediscovering all of these writers who were this kind of earlier Western Marxist tradition of like Walter Benjamin's importance. Nobody had really heard of Walter Benjamin in the West until, outside of Germany, maybe until the 70s, 60s, 70s. So his whole rediscovery in the New Left was sort of testament to going back and saying, wait, there's another lineage of Marxism that's not this kind of social realist, kind of rigid structure. And she was one of the main translators of this, and she had studied modern languages and was well-versed at Oxford, I believe, and was well-versed in German philosophy, from Hegel to Heidegger and so forth. And so I make the point that when they leave, because Berger at this point is done with England, and they leave, she gets a job as a translator in Geneva, and he follows her. And his writing changes, and it opens up at this time. And part of that is the silence of exile, the patience of exile, not being sort of like the equivalent of on Twitter all the time, like he was, in the 50s, of like reacting to every exhibit. But it's also Anya Bostock imbuing his kind of writing with this sense of, it's really palpable, this sense of European continental thought. And this mixture of kind of, they spend a lot of time in the south of France, in Le Luberon, a beautiful region, but
She followed him to Geneva.
He followed her to Geneva, but he bought a house in Bagneux, and actually Peter de Francia had bought a house in Lacoste. It was this weird area where a bunch of artists, this other guy Sven Blomberg had a house there. So it's a lot of these like British, or Sven Blomberg was Swedish, but artists that had kind of were working the land and walking around naked and, like getting sunburned and stuff, and raising, animals. And so it was this very kind of French, like expat kind of life, but she was translating Lukács. So you have to realize it's like they're taking walks in the French sun as she's translating Lukács, and they're rediscovering the Lukács-Brecht debate over realism. And all of this is, wouldn't, it would be some years before all of the kind of Trotsky students in Oxbridge discover this. But Berger's discovering these texts in his living room. So you have to imagine this is like a couple where they're thinking what to make for dinner as they're saying, well, what does Lukács mean here by totality? It's a very heady, very heady.
When did Ernst Fischer come in?
Around this time too. So Ernst Fischer is another kind of, Berger always slayed the English father figures, but always adopted the continental father figures. So Ernst Fischer is another interesting cameo in the book. He's an Austrian Marxist who lived in the Hotel Lux in Moscow during World War II. All this history, you have to realize this generation that had been marked by war, revolution, counter-revolution, depression, populism, Second War. And Fischer kind of becomes a father figure for Berger. And he gets a lot of the confidence to really kind of combat the official Marxist line through Fischer in art, because Fischer thumbed his nose at the East Germans. And I think there's a moment where there's a conference that's seen as the precursor to the Prague Spring that was held about Kafka in 1963 to kind of recuperate Kafka. And Kafka was the author that for a lot of Eastern Europeans sort of predicted the totalitarian experience, right? Like we talk Kafkaesque, you're lost in this kind of totalitarian bureaucracy. And Fischer wanted to recuperate Kafka, and an East German critic said, like, I don't see this as a spring, I just see bats coming out at nightfall. And Ernst Fischer said, are you going to give Kafka a permit to stay? Meaning like just needling these bureaucrats. And I think that kind of chutzpah was Berger had no problem standing up to the aesthetes, but to stand up to the kind of hardline communists is a different matter. And I think he got that opening was created by this man, Ernst Fischer, who died. Berger actually has an amazing essay because he was there the day that he died. Yeah.
About when the book The Necessity of Art, Fischer's The Necessity of Art, in translation, Bostock's translation in 1963 came out, Frederick Jameson said, a critic more at home in a night school than a graduate seminar. I thought, well, in these terms, that's what we are here. We're a night school, not a graduate seminar. I take that anytime. But.
Yeah, I point that out. I don't think Fred Jameson, who I've met, is a wonderful man, but he was writing Marxism and Form right around this time, and he wanted to get away from a specific kind of simplistic criticism for a more theoretically abstract one. But yeah, he doesn't say that only about Fisher. He says that about a specific genealogical form of Marxist criticism. Anyway, but he does kind of say, like, Marxism has only been for the night school, for the kind of workers, and we want to have something in academia and the grad seminar where we can really dig in. Berger would never be part of that. He'd never be part of that project.
Another thing that comes through is how central Merleau-Ponty is. I hadn't really known that. And along with that, because Merleau-Ponty is talking about acid, and Berger eschewed drugs, and that was always a big mystery to me, because I always considered that a failure of curiosity or something. But
yeah,
why?
Somebody asked at a reading before, like, what he thought about Dylan and rock music in the 60s and so forth, and had he missed this. And I think to a certain extent he had. He's a lot older than a lot of those folks. By the time the 60s is happening, he's already in his late 40s, so he's not, but it makes sense to me. I always wondered, I was like, did Berger smoke pot? Because I kind of think I sort of thought he did, it would have, but I think he's one of those people who doesn't need to smoke pot because he sort of can just turn on the stonedness in his mind and is so hyper aware. But I did come across, one of these kind of new left guys was in an interview a rare interview that I turned up somehow, was asking him about drugs. And he just said the couple experiences that he'd had with drugs had been so miserable that he, But I think that he always said that's a personal thing. I don't think he...
Certainly liked his eau de vie.
Yeah, that's true. He drank alcohol. But I want to know, how was I hard on Berger? I'm curious. I want to, because I think that's interesting to me. Because I knew that I wanted to write a book that I read a lot of things written about Berger that were kind of, I think, for Berger. You know what I mean? It's like they were kind of wanting the approval of the father figure, and I think, there's this kind of moment in like a lot of I think, I don't know, it's Freud or just psychotherapy in general, sort of about like being able to tolerate ambivalence about your parents, so they're not all good or all bad, and that you see them as human. And I think I kind of at one and the same time saw Berger as more human, but also more amazing at the same time because of his humanity. And I think for a lot of, there's been a kind of gap in the criticism of Berger, where he's either caricatured as this kind of incontinent Marxist satyr who's, like in England in particular, he's caricatured all the time as this guy who's just kind of frothing at the mouth and wild man and makes no sense. And David Sylvester calls him a clown, or, sort of just like, Roger Scruton is saying, oh, it's such indigestible,
Called him a clown because he didn't like Francis Bacon.
David Sylvester called him a clown. He both called him a clown, and then he called him a Boy Scout too, which is interesting because I guess he's like a Boy Scout and a clown. But to point out something that just about David Sylvester and Francis Bacon, because they were kind of arch nemeses. So David Sylvester was the critic who really kind of, if every kind of canonical artist has their critic, so in the way that like Jackson Pollock had like Rosenberg, Bacon really had Sylvester. And he's still angry at Berger's attacks on Bacon years later. And there's a very interesting interview where he says, Berger was a clown. He was doing all this damage It's like, well, what kind of damage? To Bacon.
Market.
No, exactly. Yeah, exactly. He said the damage is that here's Bacon, this amazing artist, and his paintings aren't selling for as much as they could be selling. And I just think that's so revealing in the way in which sort of damage and the role of the critic is basically as a kind of auctioneer or some kind of like, who's the guy that was the head of the Fed? I'm blocking on his name. He just wrote this book. Neoliberalism guy, ran the federal bank.
Yeah.
Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan. I feel like a lot of critics are basically like the Alan Greenspans of the art market, or want to be like that, where they kind of are like seeding it here.
With that same kind of language.
Yeah.
That same Weasley language.
Yeah, exactly. And Berger hated that. But yeah, I think I would say that I think that Berger had a lot of scores to settle, but after the 70s, I think the real miracle of his career is that, and I try to bring this out in the book, is that he became somebody who was defined more by what he loved than by what he was against. And I think a lot of angry young men grow into being very curmudgeonly old men. A lot of white men in particular, when they get older, become very kind of curmudgeonly and right-wing and right-leaning, bitter, and kind of, they don't get the world, and they're impatient with the youth and with music, the young music and stuff. And Berger, I think, got younger as he got older. And that's something that I think is just one of the amazing kind of like examples that he sets that's so inspiring. And part of that is he lets go of the kind of Oedipal score settling. And he starts to really want to make himself a better person. And he moves to a peasant village in France and really starts working the land. And
And becoming a good father.
So
he had two children, Katja and Jacob, with Anya Bostock.
Yeah.
The relation with Jacob was
Tense.
bad,
Or
strange for
Yeah.
a long time. And then when he married Beverly, and they had Eve,
Yeah.
everything, he became kind of
Very
the father
nurturing.
that he wasn't before,
And I think
and grandfather.
And I think a biographer might just kind of talk about this in the personal, but I think it's interesting in the historical as well, because Jacob actually historicized his father's neglect, what he perceived as his father's neglect, as a generational thing, that for all these new left guys, he said that they were kind of like political alpha males. And that they thought they could just remake society from scratch and get rid of tradition. And that to have that attitude and then to have an infant that you have to care for is doesn't make too much sense. And I think that by the time Berger kind of has reinvented himself as a storyteller and a man who lives in a village, he's much more interested in tradition and continuity, in resilience and resistance, and in love, really, as like the act of resistance par excellence. And so I think that really changed him. And I think, so that's what I find so miraculous about his career. It's not any one thing that he wrote, but if you get to know his trajectory, it's absolutely remarkable. And there are these, I am hard on him at certain times because, but I think, I don't think.
There's one place where I really question, it's what you said about Steven Spender's despicable comparison of a painter of our time to Goebbels' Michael.
Yeah.
And you indicate that the novel was not torpedoed by Spender's censure.
Where do I say it?
On page 70.
I think I want to complicate in Berger's. There's a really the question of Cold War censorship is interesting because something I didn't mention about A Painter of Our Time, which is his first novel, is that it is effectively censored, but I think it's soft censorship, and I think
I always thought that the publisher pulled it. They pulled it off the shelves.
There's actually, I think there's always the sort of mythopoetic rendering and then the reality. And I think that the two have a relationship. I don't think it's hypocritical. But I think, and maybe Berger always says that he wrote this novel and it got suppressed because of Steven Spender's review, which compared it to Goebbels because of a line in the novel where Berger expresses sympathy for the sort of Soviet guy this guy Kadar, who then took over from Naj. And the novel, interestingly, was written in a window because it was finished before Naj, who was the leader of Hungary's sort of resistance, was executed. So it was finished before the sort of full kind of brutality of the Soviets was sort of made manifest. But it's unclear. It wasn't exact. I think I say that there were political reasons and there were commercial reasons, and the two were helped along. But either way, he learned, I think, very early on that and I say this, I think, to young writers in the room too, and to myself, because I have my first book coming out. And when you have a first book that comes out, it's a very kind of anxiety-inducing experience, potentially, because you want people to like it. But for Berger...
The novels did not sell well.
No, Berger's first novel, which I think is amazing, was Remaindered. And I think we don't know exactly because people weren't buying it, or because... I say, these things go together. This is the sort of idea of soft censorship. When we think of censorship, we think of a higher up person saying, don't publish this, or pull this from the gallery or something. But in the Cold War, there's all sorts of kind of business pressures that intertwine with this, and I think that it was complex. But certainly he said that he learned early on to keep going regardless of whether the press lick or bite, which I think is an interesting thing, especially if you're a young writer or artist. You want recognition so badly, and you want the press to recognize you. But I think it's important to be able to kind of be persistent in the face of failure. And his next two novels were absolute failures. So, but he came back and then wrote something that nobody would have ever expected, which is this novel G. So
I think one of the remarkable things about the book is that it's written by an American.
Yeah.
And you managed to, because a lot of the world that you're describing in Britain and in Europe is very hard for an American to get their mind around. I mean, it's a really different world. Mm-hmm. And I know that you lived in Europe in formative years, mm-hmm. I guess, but it doesn't seem like it's written by an American. In that, does that make sense?
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, it is a compliment. It is a compliment.
I think one thing that it did enable me was that in England in particular, there's sort of Berger's legacy. There's like the court of Berger. Yeah. You know, there's the people that kind of are there that are protective of the legacy and I think when I had that red pill, blue pill moment, I recognized that also not going into the castle you have some advantages, actually. Mm-hmm. And that you have a certain distance. Yeah, and that's what Berger was always kind of an outsider and a gatecrasher, and I kind of wanted to have this conjure the spirit of Berger in my own writing about him.
Kept moving to be outside.
Yeah, he never stayed in one of these like little cozy kind of cliquish.
I mean, the other thing in the book is this tension always between the British and European attitudes, political and aesthetic. Yeah. And even as you say, Berger was more influenced by Central European and Italian intellectuals really than Brits.
But I would say, to your question though about being an American writing about this, and this is spending so much, some people when they write biographies, they spend so much time with the subject, they start to hate the subject. That did not happen with me, and the reason.
Well, that's clear in the book.
Yeah. I was deeply sympathetic, and I became sort of more in awe of him, but in a way that also recognized the chiaroscuro aspect of the life.
There's the narrative, the arc of the thing that I was describing before is, for me, is a generational thing too, because you weren't born when most of this was happening. You're looking back in a certain way, and the trajectory of your move into Berger is really, you talk about it specifically a couple of times in the book, about the generational part of it. What certain parts of Berger's work means to your generation.
To younger people.
Yeah,
definitely. I think I didn't have an Oedipal relation with Berger because for me he was more like a grandfather than a father. So I didn't, and a lot of the closest thing to a disciple he ever had was this guy Peter Fuller, who then later totally slayed him, and he wrote a book called Seeing Berger, and then later amended it to Seeing Through Berger because he got angry. But no, I never had that dynamic with him. But I would say, though, the thing that sustained me through this, and that I think makes Berger such a great writer, it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, is that through him, you can encounter all sorts of histories. And so for me, Berger was my way to learn about European socialism. Berger was my way to learn about phenomenology. Berger was my way to learn about the peasants as a class. My way to learn about British, experience during World War II. So again, he was this kind of interface to all sorts of things that I'd somehow missed, and I was deeply curious about.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we should open it up to you. What do you want to ask?
And we have wine after this. Yes, okay. And pizza. So, I actually bought About Looking, and then, which is a book of his essays from the 70s and 80s. And I took it back to Ahmedabad, where I stayed for a while and just sort of studied. I think it might have been this essay called The Suit and the Photograph, which is about August Sander and these peasants that are getting dressed up in suits to go to a ball, and how they look different in suits than kind of bourgeois subjects. I also read, and it's a weird essay, and I read the Why Look at Animals essay, which is really weird. It's like, why look at animals? I don't know, but I think that I'd spent a lot of time around animals, and India is a country where there's a lot of animals everywhere. And he was kind of onto something. Like, people used to spend a lot of time with animals, and now we don't, unless we have a pet. So I think that was, and then I read G, which blew my mind, and then I read To the Wedding, and I was like, what is going on here? Because these are such different books. And that's when I was sort of really hooked. And then I remember when I got back, I read aloud with my mom a couple times, Here Is Where We Meet. And that book just destroyed me. That clinched it for me. I was like, this writer has achieved something in this book that I would recommend for those of you who've never read Berger before. I think Here Is Where We Meet is an amazing book. It's phenomenal. But it's all the more phenomenal if you see how he got there. Here's a man who's so theoretical, so abstract in his youth, and able to kind of arrive at such a grounded way of writing without any kind of renunciations, but everything kind of coalesces into this amazing work. But it was his essays. I remember underlining his essays, and every word asks you to kind of, he doesn't, as he once said with another writer, he doesn't gargle with words. It's very direct. And so you have to really kind of flex your brain when you read it. But in a way that's not the same as like Derrida or something, where you have, it's sort of like, so with Berger, it's very kind of, it's almost like he's like trundling along in a wheelbarrow when he writes, and you have to kind of follow him. He didn't like America, which is weird because he has such a following here. And he married an American woman, and his son has an American passport. I don't go into this, I don't psychoanalyze, but for a long time he split his time between two women. One was American and the other was Russian. Formed in the Cold War sort of period, I think he was caught between these two impulses, and America was always the kind of enemy But he came here once or twice. I mean, his son went
He
to...
did?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Only twice?
Yeah, he didn't come here very much.
I tried to get him to come to New York once.
Oh, he would never come. No, I only know of... He went to Mexico later in his life to meet Subcomandante Marcos, but he came to New York in the 70s. Yeah, his editor was transferred to New York, and he wrote an essay that's not anthologized called Manhattan, which he basically says Manhattan, this is like, we're in Manhattan. He says Manhattan is like Dante's lower rung of hell. Basically, he says that the streets look like the streets have been bruised. And he says that this is a city where people are used to being every day betrayed by their own hopes, and that their souls have been turned inside out, and they bear this sort of trauma of. All right. Yeah, no. So he like really had, and he also was kind of afraid of flying. So. Yeah, he would travel everywhere in motorcycles. But his son went to NYU film school, and a lot of his friends were American, and he never held it against Americans. And he had a huge readership in America, and he actually preferred the publishers he worked with in America to England. So it's a complex relation. But after 9/11, he certainly had after the Iraq invasion, had newfound reason to get back on the kind of anti-American. Do you know a writer that was actually weirdly very important to him for his writing about peasants? It was Raymond Carver. Yeah, so I think that he had a lot of respect for a certain kind of American regionalist fiction writers. He corresponded with a number of Americans too, but the American left. The American government he always was deeply suspicious of. And his decision to give the money to the Black Panthers was also partly motivated by the fact that the Booker Prize, the money for that prize derived from the Booker McConnell Corporation, which had a lot of sort of plantation-like holdings in the West Indies. And so I think this is also one of the reasons why I think he should have gotten the Nobel Prize, but they were never going to give it to him because the Nobel money comes from dynamite, right? So, and they knew that he would say something about it. But a lot of people around him got the Nobel Prize. Doris Lessing got the Nobel Prize. Harold Pinter got the Nobel Prize.
Do you know if he was on the list?
I mean, I don't know. He was friends with the Portuguese writer who wrote Blindness that got the Nobel Prize. Saramago, thank you. Yeah, but I think it's a shame he never got that. But it was this key moment for him. And I think it is interesting because I actually think that Berger's writing could potentially have a lot to say for, I was thinking about this sort of the history of Black liberation in this country. And it's interesting that he never totally wrote about that. But the way that he wrote about cyclicality in movements, of how certain social movements, like in '68, that you kind of touch an earlier moment, I think is interesting when you think of like the moment of Black Lives Matter in relation to the late '60s and these kind of like energies that are frozen and then released and frozen and released. And I think his writing has a lot of applicability to the American experience, but he never came here. He never wanted to deal with it. He never wanted to deal with the weirdness, which is a shame. He never wrote very well about city life, and he never appreciated it. He never appreciated the kind of spontaneity, the sense of strangers interacting, the density. He just temperamentally wasn't.
We just coagulated capitalism.
He said that a city is just a lot of money changing hands at all times. That's what when a peasant goes to a city, that's all they notice. It's just money moving, changing hands. And so he had a very kind of dystopian view of the city. But he spent time in Paris and later in his life. But I think he needed that separation. Well, Yugoslavia is also interesting because in the sense of the end of the Cold War being a sort of, in the West, we like to think of the end of the Cold War as being this great thing, and finally the Soviet Union has sort of cast off its oppressive past. But in Yugoslavia, the end of the Cold War was not a good thing in terms of the violence and the ethnic violence. And I think he always had an attachment to the Balkans and the East, and he and spent a month in a town. I forgot the name of the town, but I think it's now would be in Bosnia, and spend a month because he started in the early 70s. He wanted to write this trilogy about a city movement from the countryside to the city. And it's very interesting that actually the kernel for that came when he spent a month in this town in Bosnia that later was the site of a lot of ethnic cleansing. When he was there, I think he had memories of people living side by side and in some kind of workable harmony. I think there's a few responses. I think it's partly historical, that the left in general at that time was very interested in third worldism. So the post-war interest in the working class kind of was ceded to kind of anti-imperialist struggles of Cuba and the Algerian war with France and so forth. And I think he started to get interested in the neighbors of Europe. So I think his book, A Seventh Man, I'm not sure where the seed for that comes from, but what's interesting is that his interest in the peasants comes from that. Because he said that when the migrants, he made this book, A Seventh Man, which is an amazing mixture of photography and text about the experience of young men coming from the South to live in the North. And it's kind of rendered in an archetypal, it's a very interesting kind of montage project of archetypal kind of journey of almost like a Joseph Campbell, kind of like leaving home, going to the big city, but intercut with all sorts of statistics about political economy. And
done with the great photographer Jean Moore, who also just died last week.
Yeah, and who was an amazing man and an amazing friendship. That friendship between them was very special, and they would work together to make these photo text kind of projects. And he interviewed a number of these workers, and he said that he could kind of picture their life in the cities, and he would go to the factories and so forth. But all of these men were the sons of peasants. And so it's very interesting that the two kind of figures that were so important to him and that he maybe romanticized, but that was important to his politics and that he had so much sympathy for, was the figure of the migrant worker and the figure of the peasant. One totally rootless, without a home, and the other totally rooted. Dialectical opposites, and yet separated only by one generation. And in the book, I even kind of compare it to painting and photography for him. I think he sees photography as a kind of art of a rootless modernity, where we've all been totally uprooted from home and we've lost our sense of bearings. Whereas painting is very much about place and staying in one place. But yeah, he's an amazing writer because of his sympathies for very few northern or kind of upper middle class writers end up having sympathies for folks outside of the kind of urban professional class. And Berger certainly did, and it's remarkable. First of all, my dissertation sort of was out of left field. It wasn't, I saw a lot of other grad students who would, good friends of mine, but they sort of think strategically of what would sell well. And from the beginning, I knew that this was going to be a hard sell to a committee. But I had one father figure type person who's a supervisor who wrote his dissertation about Andre Bazin. And this person happened to be the chair. And so I knew if they were going to say anything bad about me, it would also sort of and so there's a lot of power dynamics you have to be aware of in school. When I wrote it, I tried to from the beginning, I kind of tried to write it as like a software program that could run in the operating system of a scholarly kind of academic, like Windows, but also on a kind of more non-academic, like Mac or something, if that makes sense. Like I tried to write it in this dual thing, and a lot of energy went into that. And I increasingly find that a lot of writing that I like to read is either like really dry and academic, or it's really this kind of like puff piecey stuff that could be in like an in-flight magazine, that passes for cultural, like I'm sitting with so-and-so as they're munching on this at this bakery, and like the passion with that they do this like reflects, and I'm just like, this is not even rigorous at all, And I think so I tried to make something that was rigorous and entertaining, or like in the writing of the dissertation, but that I always knew would be an intermediate document that had all of my research for it. I put it away for a year and didn't think about it once. And then a lot of things happened in my life, and when Berger died, it was at this moment where he died in the early 2017. Trump had just been elected. Everybody's reeling, trying to figure out what's going on. I had just moved to Ohio, and I was seeing this sort of left behind demographic and liberal arts college. And I was sort of just figuring out what is happening. I was sort of, and I started rewriting it, and I really tried to shed all of the kind of scaffolding of the research. So I had to wade through all the research, but I tried to bring out the kind of core narrative question of each chapter. So each chapter, there's a kind of, I try to make the chapter have a beginning, middle, and an end, and make it more readable. So it's this middle ground. It's not a work of scholarship. It's not for my tenure or anything. It's not for that. It's a passion project for me. But I wanted it to be accessible and to respect the reader, to also know that this is not, just puffy or kind of a meringue or something. There's actual substance here too. Because I respect that. And I think that in the last few years, we've seen a space opening up for really theoretically informed writing that's also really personal and really honest. And it's so exciting. Because it seems like you kind of had to choose between either doing this kind of journalistic template or academic template. And there's this really exciting kind of middle ground that people are exploring, Maggie Nelson or all sorts of, Fred Moten, all these people are starting to explore where they don't need to kind of suppress their theoretical thoughts, nor do they need to suppress their more kind of human thoughts. So I tried to lean into that when I rewrote it and just absolutely forget the academic context. Well, I'm curious to hear what other people think about, what is the discussion now about art and the art market? Because I don't come from that background. It's bad? Right, that a lot of the money, it's a sort of cultural laundering for folks that get their money in a bad way to kind of support the arts, to feel better about themselves, and to kind of, and if you're a poor artist, I think that it's something, I think it's like we're subject to these forces. And I think I'm much more hopeful in the last few years, because I think that there's less of a sellout culture than there was in the 80s and 90s. But
how did he respond to that culture?
He hated it. Yeah, what's interesting is that first of all, Berger by that point had no interest in it at all. And I think he stopped caring. And that's interesting. I mean, he would sometimes say that some people describe him as one of the most influential art critics working today, and yet he doesn't know a single gallerist to get a friend at an exhibition. So he's absolutely not in that world. Of all the art critics that become prominent, he had probably the least expensive collection. A lot of these critics start collecting their friends and have like multi-million-dollar collections. But I think in the 50s, even in the 50s, he saw this happening, and he said some I mentioned this in the book, that his analysis, his evaluation of certain artists are wide of the mark, of individual artists, but his attack on the system of art is actually very prescient in the 50s. And he hates the term the art world. he really despises this term, and he says that this is because it suggests that art is separate, it's its own world, and he always wanted art to be just part of life. And then also because it suggests that people want to be artists not because they have something they want to communicate, but because they want to belong to this very glamorous world. And they want to be able to kind of, be friends with this or that person. That kind of rises to celebrity culture in the art world as such. And I think he very much saw this happen in the very early stages, and had no qualms calling it out. It's very difficult to call it out now if you want to be an artist because, or a critic, because you depend on it. I mean, it's the same thing if you're an academic. You depend, you need healthcare. You need. So I think he found ways to make a living that were outside of the kind of circuits of dependency, either with the university or with the art world. And that let him have this kind of self-righteous, just like voice in the wilderness kind of quality of just like these people. And he was losing his shit in the 50s. And he was saying, in front of painting after painting, I don't understand, why are these people making art? This is horrible. He was going off the rails, and then he just, I think, stopped engaging. And that's actually to his detriment. A lot of art critics who came after him said Berger missed so much of post-war art because he just didn't engage. He didn't write about Joseph Beuys, or he didn't write about...
He did write about Beuys.
He did. Briefly.
Yeah. But you're right, he checked out.
He kind of checked out. But I think so I would just say that his writing and he also in the 80s and 90s, he kind of was not very relevant, actually. And a lot of people in England said, what are you doing over there hanging out with peasants when Thatcher's coming to power? And, why aren't you on this front line of the class struggle? And I think that it's true that critique holds water, but he started to get interested in the land and in using your body to work and these things that were not very fashionable at the time. This is the sort of height of post-structuralism. And, but I think it sounds cheesy, but by staying true to this and be willing to tolerate being irrelevant for a while, he's weirdly come back around once post-structuralism has kind of hit something of a wall or a dead end, and we're trying to figure out, well, thank goodness. Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to read any more of that stuff, necessarily. But I think Berger is a figure who I kind of compare him to Bernie Sanders at one point because no. Well, I think what I mean by that is that he's somebody who was, I think, seen as sort of irrelevant and in the woods for a while, but then history's come back. But yeah, I think you're right that running away from art school at 16 is one choice, or running away from boarding school to art school is one choice. Leaving England is another choice. And then the third critical choice in his life was moving to this village and saying goodbye to a lot of all that. David, what?
Well, I think the thing about Berger that actually comes through in Josh's book is that he figured out how to play the game, and he beat the game several times. He beat it as a New Statesman Marxist critic, he beat it with Ways of Seeing, he beat it with G, the Booker Prize, all that. And then he broke out, he broke free. This is very unusual to do that. Anytime and anytime.
Particularly for men.
Men, women, everybody. It's hard to do that.
I think he was uncomfortable with fame too, and I think he made this decision to move to the village at the height of his fame, and I think he didn't want to be. He's such a charmer, he's a very charming man and is a bit of a seducer too. And I think that he recognized that if he was in the mix, if he was living in New York and one of these famous art people, that could be the end of you. I think you can just become a slave to the charm that you have over other people. And I think, and the power that you manifest on a day-to-day basis with interactions with younger people and admirers and so forth. And we've seen that, here with certain figures that have abused that, right? That's come to light in the last couple of years. So I think it was self-survival too. And he, after Ways of Seeing, he got so many invitations to be like the writer in residence. And Thoreau, I think it's Thoreau, said that the price of anything is the amount of life you'd have to give up for that thing. And I think he recognized that for him, that path was like not gonna help him. And so he went back to very basics. He did not have plumbing. It was freezing. He had to shit in the outhouse across the driveway, and it's not for everybody. But I think for him, he had suffered a crisis, and this was his way of kind of reconnecting. But I also, what David was mentioning is I think we shouldn't over-romanticize it too much, because he still maintained connections with his publishers. He still was an hour's drive away from Geneva, which had an airport where his ex-wife lived and his 2 kids. So I think you have to be really clever to be really have a lot of integrity or something. It's a paradox. Does that make sense? Like, you have to, he was smart enough he was shrewd in his own way because of all that he was demanding of himself in terms of staying true to certain kind of life choices that he was making. So it's not that he said goodbye and disappeared like some Rimbaud move. He continued to write, but and he continued to cultivate relationships with publishers, but he didn't want to be in the thick of it on a kind of day-to-day, evening-to-evening way. And I think he did it because that was his way to survive, honestly. I think he was at a brink at that point. In his film, Jonah, he collaborated with a Swiss filmmaker, Alan Tanner, made Jonah, who will be 25 in the year 2000. At the time, he was having his kid, who would be 25 in the year 2000. Rousseau is from Geneva, and they pass him. And that film got slammed by some of the hardliners on the left for saying that it's going back to Rousseau instead of Marx. But certainly, he's a romantic. And if Rousseau is the sort of origin of romanticism, something is corrupted by society for him, for sure. He has a Rousseau fetish. I think that's accurate.
Thank you
Wine?
all for
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.